Thought I recognized you the first time I saw you.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. So, I guess we easily say welcome to Bible study here at South End United Methodist. We're taking a slight detour off our normal work. We've been going through the man, this is starting off in a stellar way here. We've been doing the book of Romans, but we're taking a detour for the purpose of the ordination videotape Bible study. So we're in the Gospel of Mark now, or for tonight, which we will kind of be honest, we're cheating a little bit, because we already went through Mark in a little more of a detailed form in the beginning of the liturgical year, so this might be repetitive for some of you. But then again, we probably reread a lot of the same stories over and over again, so it's all repetitive to some degree as we work through. And we're going to do session 3 tonight. Of the 4 sessions, because it's probably my favorite of the 4 stories I used in my the Bible study I crafted. I think it ties in the whole study as a whole, so that's why we're going to be here. And we'll kind of cheat a little bit more past that and ask some questions even from the first 2 sessions to set the table and tie us in to Mark 5 and the Gerasene demoniac on that front. So I chose in my Bible study on Mark to talk a lot about healings and demon possession. You know, lighthearted stuff. Because you tend to find a lot more healings and exorcisms in Mark, even more than the other Gospels. Right? I always made the joke that Mark reads like a highlight reel of Jesus' earthly ministry, you know, like highlight after highlight, healing to healing, teaching to teaching, exorcism to healing, and it's just one after another stacked on top of each other, kind of in mini episodes to form the chapters, which I think kind of in some ways opens us up for the first question of Mark. Why are these healings, why are these highlights of Jesus' ministry so important to Mark? What is Mark trying to say about the person of Jesus, the authority, the power of Jesus, or the good news in and of itself? Why the healings and the exorcisms? Why are they such a big part of Mark's gospel? Any ideas on that?
I think one maybe obvious answer possibly is to show the power of Jesus.
Yeah.
Simply. Maybe the power over death, the power over evil, to show his provenance, as the Son of God.
Oh yeah, I think that's kind of it's like the easiest answer, right?
Right, it's the easiest answer.
I think it's true, right? I think Jesus' power over the illnesses and the disease and the issues of this world, not just big picture, but on the individual needs as well. That want for healing and restoration is individual as much as communal. Which I think is kind of interesting, because I think we think of we think today of the good news as really individualized, right? Your personal relationship with Jesus, right? You know, what does it mean for you to pray and work out this relationship? And so in the modern context, I think we're always reminding the communal aspect of healing and restoration. But maybe the inverse is true in Mark. We've come out of an Old Testament understanding where we believe God's activity and intervention to be very big picture and communal in nature. What God wanted for God's whole people. So then you have the personhood of Jesus on a very individual, case-by-case, person-by-person basis, seeing redemption and restoration. We are having this conversation on the week preparing for All Saints in a way where we talk about all things being made new. We're talking about all things being made new for individuals as well as communal. So it's kind of the inverse, maybe sometimes what we do today. Other ideas on the healings and the highlights of Jesus.
Well, I apologize if our study of John is. You're going to hear me say that all the
Don't worry,
time.
I have the notes.
I was, so taken with our study of John that, this may be from John and not necessarily from Mark's perspective, but is it that these signs were put forward to prove that Jesus was God's son? I mean, signs, put forward for that. And I know when I was doing some reading on Jesus, the reading that I was doing about, there's a difference between healing and the demon possession. Maybe I'm getting ahead.
Those are kind of two different aspects of power and
right, and
intervention.
It kind of showed a difference between what they consider to be demon possession and maybe what we consider to be an illness.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things we'll get at specifically. No, it's one of the things I put in my notes that I find interesting as we come off the book of John, where John has made a lot of big, heavy theological statements about Jesus, right? The big I am statements that we talked about. But it's interesting, John makes these claims about God or claims about Jesus, but doesn't feel the need to really prove them. I am the way, the truth, and life. And there's kind of a take it or leave it aspect. John doesn't then, extrapolate and prove his statement. It's nope, this is who I am. Believe it or don't. Mark kind of does the inverse, right? Mark is okay, let me give you all these proofs of Jesus' actions, and then we'll talk about who Jesus is. John's going to talk about who Jesus is. Mark's going to talk about Jesus is what Jesus does. Don't just say it, show me, right? Which once again, in verse of John, where Jesus is against using signs to prove his divinity, because it takes away from the belief aspect, right? If you have to prove something, well, I really didn't believe it, right?
Well, it was a step on the journey, wasn't it? I mean, that's how Jesus was trying to get people's attention. Because, miracles, and then something's going on here. There's something to this.
But it's very easy, I think, to then trap Jesus in the identity of just a healer, or just a miracle, right?
There are a lot of those.
Yeah.
There in that day and time.
So I think it's funny because you see Jesus in Mark eventually try to kind of work out of just being a healer identity, it was a part of, but not the whole, right? So you think,
I think maybe another reason why he presents Jesus as a healer and a caster out, I guess, of demons is to illustrate how different people responded to that.
Yeah.
Right? So, for instance, when Legion is cast out, and it's also interesting how Legion asked permission to cast himself out. Anyway, it's interesting how but anyway, I digress. But anyway, so he's cast into the swine, and of course they run into the sea and drown themselves. And then right after that, it says, those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood, right? And it's just, that's not a response I would have expected.
Yeah.
It's if you sensed that there was evil in your presence and you saw someone casting it out, it seems like you would want to encourage him to stay.
Yeah.
For pest control, shall we say?
But I think it's always it's a cyclical aspect of Mark's stories of the healing, the proof of the healing, then the reaction to the healing, right? Sometimes the reaction to the healing says a lot more about the why you told the story than the actual story does, especially in John. But definitely in Mark, right? And I think that's one of the questions we ask in the earlier sessions of, especially in the early exorcisms in Mark, these actions are viewed as like a new teaching, right? And now I think we find them to be very much in line with like God's will for the world and God's will for creation. So why is the healing and the exorcisms viewed as a new teaching? And then why, because we all know that new always freaks people out, right? To do anything new is to get some eyebrows raised, right? But why was this new, right? And, yeah.
The healings and the casting out of the demons, to me, were always on an individual. It was between Jesus and one person. He didn't pray for healing of the crowd as a whole, or for the sick people in the crowd. Most of it, you tell me where I'm wrong, and I probably am, but it was like one sick person that he prayed for, and I think it shows that a couple of things, that he's interested in us, and an illness. If you have experience in the illnesses, I've never really experienced a terribly serious illness, but I would think, and from what I have seen of people who have, it's very, what I'm going to call life-consuming, and loving those people and caring for them can be also.
Yeah.
And that's where Jesus became a personal savior to me.
Well, I think that's such a powerful, I guess, example and model of healing and care that Jesus gives you. Now, I know I'm saying this to a room with people who've been career nurses, right? That so much of care is individualized. It is case by case, right? It's not just one size fits all treatment. As much as we'd like it to be, right? Wouldn't we like just to, go through and give everybody the exact same dosage, do all that, it'd make things a lot easier, but care can't be a manufacturing line, right? And so, yes, there's part of, I find that interesting, yes, the healings and these highlight real moments, outside of the big feedings, are individual, person on person, case by case, and it's different. Like, you could look, I know throughout the study we kind of look at all four of the exorcism stories, and you begin to see some similarities, but a lot of differences, right? And, all the leprosy healings look different, because, once again, like, every instance different.
Also, I think if every instance was the same, then there's a formula here.
Yes.
If I do this, then you will.
Yeah.
And so it's not. It's about that relationship with Jesus and that one-on-one, and believing that he can heal. It's the faith, like the woman who touched his cloak.
Mhm.
And he said, faith is healed.
Mark being the first gospel written, and isn't the author, what was it please correct me, a contemporary of Peter, didn't someone who had one-on-one relationship with Peter, and
Yeah, it sounds like they're kind of working off like the Q theory of there's an existing set of stories that we don't have as an official gospel.
so what was his intent? Overall intent, obviously to write down, like Christ, but
Yeah.
specifically in Mark, what is it God's power? Is it the fact that Jesus is the son of God? What was the intent, one of the overarching themes?
Yeah, when I think of Mark, I think of the authority of Jesus, and the divinity of Jesus' earthly life, and which is important to an early church is trying to figure out, okay, was Jesus, 50% human, 50% God, or was Jesus 75, 25%? We come to the great mathematical fallacy of, he was 100% divine and 100% human, but you were trying to figure out this, and I think Mark writes a story about the the power and the authority of Jesus. And then if you get into, what the cross is in Mark, which one we talked about, really Mark's where you get a big part of sacrificial atonement theory. Mark was really kind of home to that view. So you set Jesus up to be, powerfully perfect so that you have a perfect sacrifice on that side. One of the things I think that we're hinting at, and some kind of gets into 5, you look at the different healings, or the different exorcisms, and I think we begin to see there's a difference between treating the illness and just treating the symptoms, right? You got to know what the illness is, treat the illness. Sometimes you just treat the symptoms while you're trying to figure out what the illness is. But especially early on, you look at some of these early stories, people wanted the symptoms treated. So what is the difference between treating an actual illness versus just treating the symptoms?
Actual healing.
Yeah, right? You're just putting band-aids or plugging holes with your fingers if you're chasing symptoms, right?
Well, and in medicine, it's very ironic. Sometimes until you get a diagnosis, you're treating the symptoms. Obviously, you're not just letting them run rampant. And in the hospital, you're treating them. But there are cases in which once the diagnosis is discovered, definitive diagnosis, then the treatment has to change completely, because there's some treatments to treat symptoms that actually are counterproductive based on a specific diagnosis that's given. So you have to just kind of switch the treatment out. So that's really how important diagnosis can be, in medicine.
Yeah. And I think that actually is so pertinent to the healing stories in Mark, because there's an aspect of a lot of treatment, and we've definitely experienced this in the past, year and a half and some change. Quarantining is a big approach before you figure things out, right? Sectioning things off, right? But quarantining is, it's kind of a first-ditch effort as you're trying to get your sea legs. But, quarantining and the isolation of that, in a way, comes with its own issues. If you flash back to last, once again, I was to think about this. Remember last March, we thought we were just going to lock ourselves in our houses for 2 weeks and it was all going to go back to normal, right? And of course, by day 7, at first you're like, what? This sounds great. I needed it, right? I need a few days not having to drive and commute from home. I've got enough toilet paper. I'm good, right? By day 7, you're like, guy, I need to see people, and then I've watched everything on Netflix, and there's no sports on TV. What am I going to do, right? You saw the effects of isolation, right? And I know we definitely saw it as church. Think about when I came here last August and trying to think about how do we, when can we do some form of an outdoor distance worship? And I remember the first time we had church out here on the lawn, just seeing people, not through a Zoom screen, right?
I sat on my front porch and begged walking neighbors to stop and talk to me. Yeah, will you talk to me, please?
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of all the healing and the exorcisms that happen here in Mark. Is Jesus crosses boundaries into the quarantine, into the isolation, and has conversation with people that haven't had conversation, touches people that haven't been touched, and that in and of itself is treatment, right? Just people. You might not even know what the symptoms of the illness is yet, but just that was medicine in its own way. So I think it's another aspect we see a lot of here, quarantining and isolation, while an aspect of treatment, right? An aspect of treating symptoms, treating contagions, is also in a way damaging.
Well,
Right.
it's not a cure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a cure.
Well, it's also finding that the illness is getting, or being able to treat the illness, is getting to the root cause. And you see the symptoms, but you don't know, okay, what's causing like a headache or whatever. And you can give pain medicine, but the root cause is still there. So until you find that root cause, you can't really cure it. So it was like quarantine. That was our panacea at first because then we can't spread it, but we had to find out what was causing it. And then what?
And sometimes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, sorry. Like, so sometimes the symptom is even like a fever, for example, that's the symptom of a fight. That's not the illness, that's the symptom of your body trying to fight it off. And sometimes you've got these like negative things that are going on like in your personal stuff, like someone's like a jerk to you one day or something like that, and you don't want to deal with them. Well, that might be a symptom that they've got something bad going on that they're fighting and they need help. You know?
To be listened to.
Right.
I say this all the time when working with athletes. Like, our basketball coach was talking about, do we need to be have an ice bath after every practice? Do we need to be, getting enough heating pads and really having, ice baths and heating pads so they can, I'm like, no. She's like, why not? That's what I did in college. Of course, I'm like, just because you did, that make it right. But I sit there and say, that like that ice and heat is treating, the inflammatory response of your body, right? But in reality, that inflammatory response is just a symptom, but it's an indicator of your body, adjusting or coping or maladjusting to a new stimulus. And sometimes, like icing and heating, that inflammatory response inhibits it, and that's a warning sign that something bigger might be coming. And so it's a big no-no. Like, oh, my knees hurt, let me just keep icing them so they won't hurt. And then you blow an Achilles. You're like, man, it came out of nowhere. Like, I was feeling fine. And then you talk to him, it's like, oh, man, yeah, my knees and ankles were really hurting for, a few weeks there, and I just kept icing. And it's like, oh, like, that was the warning sign. And in just treating the symptoms and inhibiting the warning sign, you actually led to a worse injury and treatment and illness because of, so conversation of how we treat the illnesses and sometimes just treating the symptoms just deadens the indicators before you get something bigger, right? Which I find so perfect. And this is almost, once again, we didn't rehearse this. A perfect transition into the demon in chapter 5, right? Because you read the story about this demon, and it's this wild character down by the docks, right? That nobody could contain. That they tried to dress, they tried to chain up, they tried to civilize, and none of it worked. And when none of it worked, they just left him down there and hoped he'd stay down in the caves and out of sight, out of mind, right? Which to a degree, it's like, so you tried to treat the symptoms and it didn't work, which I think also then asks the question of, you also tried to treat or civil or do things in the way that you thought he should be, right? And so you're kind of like putting your definitions of what life should look like. And so when that didn't conform to your system, well, then you just gave up. It's okay, that's out of mind, right? To me, this story begins in just treating symptoms rather than never getting to the root cause of why is he like this? What's actually going on? Because if somebody you read the story, somebody said, oh, he just needs his haircut and to wear different, and put some clothes on. That's the problem here. Like, let's try that. That didn't work. Well, just chain them up. And that didn't work, you know? And so, what?
So that way we don't have to look at it.
Yeah, you know, which to me is, once again, is this perfect modern challenge or correlation to the out of sight, out of minds of our society, the untouchables of our society, you know, and especially in a mental health capacity, you know. I know we have people here that have worked in and partnered with, like, you know, homeless ministries. A lot of your people experiencing homelessness are the byproducts of mental illness or trauma that leads to mental illness. Which, so you have a root cause before a root cause, you know, or the fact that our prison system is our largest mental health facility, that it's just a storage facility for people we don't know what to deal with, which starts to sound a lot like the shores that of chaining these people up and keep them outside of mind. Right?
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Are we, in this scripture passage, are we dealing with, you know, an exorcism is different than a healing, isn't it? I mean, this particular man was wrenching off chains and shackles. I mean, so do you think that he was really demon possessed? I mean,
well, that's so this is funny. One of these things that, like, I can specifically remember when I heard this question asked to me, because I always read this as like demon possession, right? And I can think of books and things that really lean into the aspects of spiritual warfare. And listen, I also think that sometimes we don't give Satan enough credit. That there is an aspect of, you know, battles to be fought that we, you know, you got to kind of know who you're fighting and have that conversation. But I remember being in Vanderbilt in a New Testament discussion group, and the TA lady in the class said, well, do we think this is demon possession, or is this just mental illness? Because you can read this and go, it sounds a lot like schizophrenia in a way. A lot of multiple personalities, a lot of self-injury, a lot of, you know, so is it demon possession or is it mental illness?
well, didn't all four Gospels have stories of exorcism?
I know Mark had the most. I don't know if all four. That'd be an interesting question. I have to follow up. I want to say yes, but I mean, my natural proclivity would be to say yes, because I think it is a part of, you know, the spiritual good news of Jesus, right? So doesn't mean to cast out evil, right? I think evil can manifest itself, and then to me, our lingo. I feel like our linguistics have changed, right? You know, we just have better definitions of things now, which to me is definitely how I understand things. Because if you go to leprosy in Mark, okay, if you think of leprosy or you Google leprosy, you're going to get some really gnarly pictures. You know how we call leprosy now, right? But leprosy at this time, you know, was really just any skin disease. Eczema would have been considered leprosy. Scabies, yeah, would have been considered. Chickenpox would have been considered leprosy. And as a kid who grew up with eczema, to sit there and think that you'd be completely kind of banished and isolated for a lot of diseases that were completely treatable. And in some senses, these illnesses were exacerbated and made worse because in isolation you couldn't even get the treatment. And if that applies to our conversation on leprosy, it probably also applies to some of what we call demon possession. You know, could there be a lot of other illnesses under the umbrella, the catch-all of demonic possession? And how many of those could have had, you know, actual, you know, have had treatable outcomes, but since they were viewed as just isolated, they probably got worse with that.
My natural bias of, I guess, of somebody that was exposed to the evangelical perspective, growing up and then ran away from it through my adult life, is to not focus on the idea of it literally being demonic.
Yeah.
But that being said, the aspect of the pigs, of the demon being rechanneled to the pigs, that's sort of, if you take it at face value, that kind of emphasizes that there was something spiritual going on and not just mental. But I don't know what your thoughts might be, Sam.
But don't you think all negative things like doubt, guilt, shame they're tools of the devil? And the way we think sometimes, I don't know, we run with it. I mean, I've talked myself out of things. And I'm going, why did I do that? And I think they're tools of the devil. So it is in its way demonic, whether it's not necessarily possession, but it's just like he plants the doubt and then he lets us run with it. So, it is in a way demonic.
There was a book written, I guess, maybe at one point, by Frank Reddy, famous Christian author. It was called, I think it was Piercing the Darkness, it was Present Darkness, and Piercing the Darkness, and there's really this it's a story of kind of spiritual warfare. So you have kind of people, and you also have these angels and demons behind the scenes, right? And there's a really powerful image in one of the opening chapters of one of the main characters who is very tormented with doubt, anxiety, and a lot of things that in one of the paragraphs, in the spiritual realm, the author illustrates all these bat-like creatures hovering around her head and going oh, let me make her second guess this question, and sinks a talon into her head, and she begins and to me at that time, and to some degree still today, is a powerful image of once again, think about the past year. We've wrestled with a lot of, am I making the right decision? Is this the next right thing? Should we be doing this? Is this right? I mean, that it's been a non-stop feeling of that. And at times you go, okay, is this, productive precaution, or is it, hindering anxiety? And then discernment, which we talked about, I think becomes a big part of how do you work between the two. But yeah, that's why I say, I think sometimes we don't give the devil the credit the devil deserves, because I think these are forces that are at work competing against our life, and I think naming them is good, right? When you just talk about them in abstract terms, they're just floating concepts. But if we begin to say, hey, I think that's this, you're getting to that diagnosis part, right? There's something powerful in naming something, right? Because in naming something, you begin to, you have a concept for it, you begin to put it in a box and have an awareness around it, which is really a big part of the interaction that happens here with Jesus and really all the demons, right? This aspect of knowing who's who is always a part of all these exorcism stories. Mark, shoot.
That's probably not Mark. I believe the demon comes in good guises sometimes. The snake, here, let me help you guys out. It's an apple. And so it's really important to name what's really going on.
Yeah, that's that root cause, right?
And going back to symptoms, if the house is on fire, I'm going to get out. I'm not going to be thinking,
Right.
I'm going to get out and get the call of the fire department and say, put this thing out.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And worry about what caused it later. And I think that's, when we don't know, like they didn't know a lot about didn't listen to the scientists and stuff. That's another story.
Yeah.
I did. I used to have, well, a long time ago, I had biology.
Yeah, but I think that's such a big part of, like I said, what you get, like naming it, you know, and there's a time to name and there's a time to not, right? There's a time to just get out of the house. You know, there's a time to just get out of the water. And worry about why don't I know how to swim and name the issues I have with my bad technique of swimming. You know, that's, you know, as you're drowning, don't be thinking, okay, how do I name what I'm doing wrong? So get out of the water. We can name it later, right? So that yes, there's a timeliness aspect to that, but you know, I think in this to a degree kind of coincides really well with, you know, the Sunday school morning going through spirituality and the 12 steps, because you know, naming takes awareness, right? You know, to what is the root cause? You know, and getting to a root cause, you know, a lot of observation, a lot of reflection, a lot of trial and error sometimes, you know, before you can make that diagnosis. One of the things I put in the notes, does anybody remember the TV show House?
Yes.
Right? And really, the plot of House was the same thing every episode. Somebody came into the hospital really sick. They didn't know what it was. And then this cranky doctor with a limp and an opioid addiction could somehow figure out what the actual issue was. And of course, it would be, you know, good, 20 minutes of not knowing what it was and trying different things and nothing working. And then all of a sudden he'd have an epiphany and, oh, it's this. And then the second they knew what it was, could treat it, the person was fixed, right? You know, and then healed and out the door, you know. But that story was basically pursuing the naming, pursuing the diet. Because once you had that, well, then the healing, which I think is an interesting thing you made, the difference between an exorcism and healing. I think what's kind of funny is in these stories that, like, the exorcism has to take place, and then healing can begin. You know, like the exorcism isn't the healing. I think in these stories, the exorcism like gets you to a point of healing. You know,
It's just the diagnosis.
yeah, right.
Well,
Because, yeah,
I was
Nick.
just saying, in naming is such a fundamental aspect of being human too. I mean, what was job number 1 in Genesis? It's name all the creatures and have dominion over them. And if you view through the lens like you were mentioning about like naming being understanding something, describing its nature, knowing all that stuff, it's you have to understand something so you can control it, so you have dominion over it, you can control it, you can put it in a box, you know how it works. You know, and so if you first name things as part of the exorcism, as part of something else, then you can move on to the next step. Just controlling it and healing it.
Yeah, because once again, name implies knowledge of or about, right? Which almost kind of implies like you have a perspective that you can look down and see, right? You know, it's like you hold the metaphorical higher ground if you can name, know, and observe. Which I then think, and I know this is completely off the beaten path, this brings light. That moment of Moses at the burning bush is huge. What does Moses ask? What's your name? Right? We always understand Moses asking, what's your name, so I can go back and tell people who sent me. Right? But maybe there's part of Moses that, like, is a bit of a control freak. And says, okay, yeah, tell me your name. And that puts us on the same plane. You very clearly know who I am. And I have no clue who you are. But if I know who you are, now we're a little more on an even playing field and I can negotiate, right? And of course, when God answers one of the most ambiguous statements, right? I am that I am. And basically gives Moses nothing to work with, right? You know, in a way saying, you don't get to name me. My name's beyond you fully being able to grasp, so I'll give you a name, but you ain't going to be able to do too much with it. Right?
Yeah, that leads me to another thought. I've had, you know, I think there's that the demon recognized the authority of Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Because, you know, when Moses was asking God what his name was, he was not giving this, well, as you put it. But here, I mean, he didn't mess around. I mean, well, I thought it's interesting because he's like, man, what do you want with me? first of all, right? The demon's like, what do you want? He sensed that this presence, this authority. And then the first thing Jesus asked him was, what is your name?
Yeah.
And he didn't hem and haw about it. He said, oh, my name is Legion, for we are many, right? And so what I find interesting about that is he recognized the authority of Jesus first off, and then he immediately responded with his name.
Yeah.
Where he could have, if it maybe had been somebody else, he could have been deceptive, he could have obfuscated in some ways, him and hawed, and, told lies,
Yeah.
Said he was somebody else, But Jesus had the authority to have him call his name right out, And so, of course, and that was
to a
the
degree,
next
I
step.
think he does that because I think we ask the question like, why? Because Legion knows, he already knows who I am. There's no point, might as well say Legion.
Right.
Right? Like, if you'd been like, my name's Tom, you'd be like,
Hey.
you want to try that again, bud? So it's like, well, let's not, we're caught now, right? But that's an which is also a big theme of Mark, right? Once again, if you read Mark through this lens, the demons know exactly who Jesus is.
Mhm.
You're the Son of God. You're that guy, right? The funny part is this is in direct contrast to nobody else in the book of Mark knows who Jesus is. The disciples have a front row seat to this and still don't know who he is. And once again, like Mark, what's a big, I guess one of the tropes of Mark is the laughable buffoonery that is the disciples. Like if you read the disciples of Mark are Larry, Moe, and Frank Hurley, just very, very Stooge-esque, Here it is. Jesus is obviously somebody with authority, and they just don't see it, right? But it's interesting. So what does that say about the short-sightedness of humanity? Or the fact that, sometimes like I said, the opposition very clearly knew who they were dealing with, right? And the people who were being saved in the process had no clue. There's a big.
And it also is indicative of how human beings sometimes can be clearly oblivious to when there is something divine, or misidentifying it, saying it's this person, whoever, when really it's over here, just kind of missing the whole point. So.
One of the things that, as we've studied, as we've done our Bible study, and my thought process is when I encounter the scriptures, I ask myself, okay, so what? What does that mean for me today? What can I glean from this today? And it's almost like, I personally believe that there are instances where, if the Holy Spirit's not in your heart, you've got a heart that's, open to the evil or to the unclean spirits or whatever you want to call it. But I think we all have demons that need exorcising.
Yeah.
And we all have to
And not
name
jumping jacks exercising.
Right.
and we all have to name them. And
Yeah.
and in my journey, I've discovered that the prince of this world is alive and well. And what he does, or what, you want to call him Satan or whatever you want to call him, is kind of obstruct your vision to keep you from naming it. So you maintain yourself in a state that you need these things exercised.
I think back to that, disguising point, back to 12-step conversation, right? We sometimes are really good at rationalizing our demons, our issues, because we get attached almost, right? Oh, don't take that away from me, right? I need that. This is a healthy distrust. I have this distrust because this happened, rather than actually be honest about it and get that out and work through and process, But there's a real vulnerability that comes in naming your demons and addictions and shortfalls. We're not good at that. And then there's, once again, we tend to have this conversation a lot better here on Wednesday nights than Sunday mornings, you know? Because I think that people want a space to be where they can safely name their faults. And I mean, that's what makes, you know, when you find somebody to have a really close friendship, a relationship with, when you can put those cards on the table, and you no longer hold those cards so close to your chest that nobody can see. Letting that guard down is profound and holy, and people want that because you don't get that out in the world. You know, you don't get to go into your place of work and be like, hey, I'm really not good at this, this, and this. Don't ask me to do that. We wish we could, right? You know, but you can't. That'll get you in trouble, right? You know, I mean, once again, you know, somebody said a few weeks ago that, like, you know, you got to the point in your career, Lynn, you said, I don't like writing policies. Don't ask me to write policies. That's a weakness. Ask me to do anything else but write policies. And if you found somebody that was good at writing policies, make really good friends with them. Like, let them do that, so you know. But it took you a long time to get to that point where...
I wrote policies and procedures for years. I
Yeah.
just didn't like doing that.
You know, but you got to a point in your career you could say, I'm not doing that anymore. Or,
Yeah.
I really don't like it. Don't ask me to do that, right? And
Well, they ask what questions you have about the job. Who does policies and procedures? Oh, I do that. Good. I didn't want to do that.
But the awareness and the experience it takes to get to that point, a lot of work. And in reality, that's the diagnosis part, right? Sometimes that diagnosis can take years. You
Well,
know?
also, I think vulnerability is really, it's hard. But like Satan's the brother and he's the accuser. So if you just lay it out and say, okay, yes, this is me, he can no longer accuse you. He's got nothing. And so, and also I think, you know, we know our faults, we know those things, and they become comfortable because we've lived them for so long. What's it going to be like if all of a sudden I put it out there? So it's change. Change is hard.
Yeah.
And to be vulnerable is super hard. But if you think, okay, I'm taking a card away from Satan, I can do this.
And one scripture that always sticks in my mind is stand up to the devil and he'll turn and run. And what that says to me is that if you name it and you know what it is, then you take that information and you take a step towards healing and restoration.
And there's something really powerful to use another tradition. Native American, like, culture and philosophy was really big into this power of naming and stories, especially the Anishinaabe tribe of the Northeast. You know, they took stories so very seriously. They believed stories to have agency. That's why they didn't just tell stories willy-nilly. Like, you only told certain stories at certain times, because to put that story out there was to give that story power. You ever heard somebody say, don't claim that, don't even say that, right? You know, that kind of comes from this concept of like, hey, you put that out there, you name it, you can then kind of take on a life of its own, and it's outside of your control, right? And that's also hard, right? Because I think part of that, like, it could be a powerful moment to, like, you know, take the accuser's wherewithal by putting your card on the table, right? So good, you don't have that card against me anymore. Then the hard part is we live in a society, like the third character, that's people, and you technically are then giving that card to somebody else. And the question might then isn't because how Satan going to use that card against you. It's like, how's Linda going to use this card against me, right? That's the real nervousness, right? So you don't just put those cards and give those cards to anybody. You know, you give them and say, hey, I'm giving you this because I trust that this won't come back and bite me later, right? You know, that's so in a sense you can't be vulnerable to just anybody. Right?
But also, another thing that, I don't know what we were talking about, but, being comfortable, like doing the policies and procedures. So, when I came back to the Lord, I mean, I'm an extreme introvert, and I was raised in a traditional church. So the only prayers that I knew were the ones that I memorized or read in the, in the books, like Our Father.
Yeah.
They were set prayers. So I went to David Lipscomb as an adult, and of course had to go to the Bible. And these 18, 19, 20-year-olds were doing all of these like extemporaneous prayers. Like, oh my gosh. And then I got into, I was over at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
And I mean, where did the Lord put me? In prayer ministry. And I was very active in several different aspects of it, but it was hard for me. But, if that's where He wants you to be, He will give you what you need to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm still an introvert. But yeah, so I think He does puts you in places where sometimes you're not comfortable, pushing you out there so that you grow.
Yeah, no, the only way to get better, right, is to do what you're bad at, right? I mean, once again, working with athletes, like, you have to improve weaknesses, right? You're addressing weaknesses, because that's the only way to get better, is to take, okay, where are you weak in your game? We can bring that up, you're better. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? Like, I mean, I could make you better at what you're already good at, but that's a lot of work. Or I could take what you're trash at and just make you average. That's easier. I remember a handful of years ago, he plays for the Jets now, Kyle, and I was talking with Kyle because Kyle was this 6'4", 260-pound kid that moved like a gazelle, had a 6'11" wingspan, and you could make a kid in a video game, it was Kyle, right? Kyle's mom was an All-American basketball player. But when I had Kyle as a senior, he had tore his labrum as a freshman, broke his collarbone as a sophomore, and tore the other labrum as a junior. Kyle hadn't even played more than 5 games a year. He'd always hurt himself. And was still considered a top 32 prospect in the nation, right? Because of some other gifts Kyle had. But Kyle never worked out. Didn't know what it meant to lift weights or get strong. Of course, had both shoulders reconstructed at this point, so he couldn't get his arms above here. And so we got to get you to where and some of these things. And you could just tell he just never done any of this before. I said, God, here, and I'm going to sit him down. So I'm like, Kyle, to this team, you're baby Jesus. Everybody thinks you're God. And so, you have to lead by example. If you buy in, everybody else is going to. Because they'll do whatever you do. So here's the thing, bud. You're going to leave me in a year, and wherever you decide to go play college football, there's going to be a much meaner strength and conditioning coach at the next level. I'm trying to get you ready for that guy. That crazy nut job, So let's talk about this. Your 6'11" wingspan makes you able to do things nobody else can. It's why you tear your shoulders up. Because the leverage is on this shoulder means you can reach out and grab somebody way far away, but that lever is why your shoulder keeps dislocating and getting torn. We have to get this shoulder stronger. We have to, develop this extreme weakness. And if we can make that weakness a strength, we then also make your strength stronger. And so we develop this adage saying, we practice weaknesses and we compete with strengths. You know? You're still going to do what you do very well out in the world. You know, so then in that sense, church becomes where we practice our weaknesses. But we go out into the world and we use our gifts. You know? And maybe eventually the weaknesses become gifts. So we use those gifts. Right? You know? And it's knowing, back to naming. Part of naming is also knowing what are your gifts and what are your weaknesses. Where are you good? Where are you weak? Right? Are the weaknesses actual weaknesses, or are they just symptoms of another root cause? There's a lot of conversations to dive down of a rabbit hole here. One of the questions I want to ask kind of in closing is to also think about this illness symptoms difference. What are conversations we have in the modern world? What are things that we think are illnesses that are just symptoms? Right? You know, and then what's the actual illness? You know, kind of the one I thought of very easily that we talk a lot about here in church is, you know, church attendance. Right? How do we get more people to come to church? What's wrong with, how do we get younger people around? How do we do that? And in a sense, I feel like we're treating a symptom. We're trying to figure out a symptom, right? We're trying to just put a Band-Aid on a very localized, but maybe that's not the answer. What's the actual illness? Why? What's happening on a bigger picture? And once we figure that out, then we can actually begin. And I know I've said that like ad nauseum before, but like the question isn't like how do we get people to church? I really honestly believe, you know, people don't have Sundays free like they used to have Sundays free. You know?
Choose to have them free.
Yeah, it could be a choice, but then a part of that choice. What?
Not always.
Let's say it might not always be because you might be working 2 jobs. Or, you know, I remember we had somebody in my old church, Edwin, and Edwin was great. Loved when Edwin was there. But the reason Edwin couldn't be there on Saturdays is because he was a mechanic at Walmart. He just had to work on Sundays. So he was, you know, he was a victim of like what his work schedule was. You know, nurses, you don't always get to pick and choose. You know, your work schedule. There's a lot of things. So once again, sometimes the symptoms and illness, and there might be other easier or other conversations on what are issues we think we're addressing. It's really just a symptom. What's the, and then how do we name it, right? You know, and in naming, we have knowledge of, and to a degree exert power over.
We look at the success that we have had Wednesday nights, and the thing about it, when we started up Wednesday nights again, in one of the transition times with the pandemic, you said you weren't saying, oh, we need to have the number, you know, we need to have 25 people, but you said, okay, we need to get back to what worked before, which was fellowship, study, keep it simple, and build. And, you know, I think we are really respectable here. But it's a sort of thing where you create, I think, and you create the, it's a symptom. It's almost like you create the good or like the positive example or whatever, and then let it grow, let things grow.
You let the outcome
Right.
happen. Yeah. Rather than just trying. Sometimes we're outcome chasing.
Right.
Rather than, you know, what's the system to produce the outcome we want, right? That takes like deeper level critical thinking, kind of really, you know, okay, if I want this, what produces that, and how do I get that which produces what I want? So there's some kind of deeper reverse engineering that has to go into goal setting, into figuring out, right? That's maybe that's where, like, you know, church is just a big episode house. you know, and trying to figure out what's the diagnosis, what's the outcome we want. And then the powerful thing about the story, I always think, is once again, the exorcism really sets the table for healing to begin, right? And then the story ends with, we know that demons have been cast out, and the pigs go over the edge of the cliff, and this very almost theatrical moment, right? And then it ends with the man clothed and calm and approaching Jesus saying, "Can I go with you? Can I follow you?" You know? And Jesus goes, "Hey, you know what? Go back to your family and tell the story." And to a degree, he says, "No, don't go with me. Go the other way. And what's happened for you, tell that story, give that story agency, and begin to make this happen for others." You know? And that's where the healing begins, right? Because can you imagine what?
Being a witness.
Yeah. And humanizing him again. Because here's the other part. Once again, Mark leaves out details that I think that can really deepen the stories in a lot of ways, right? Wouldn't you love to know the story of when he walked back into town? And people were like, "Is that? What do I think it is? Like, who got clothes on the butt?" And what was that moment like?
Well, also, I think of like P.T. Barnum, because if Jesus had agreed to have him come with him,
Yeah.
almost like he was adding to his menage,
Flock of
right,
Mary
his freaks or whatever,
Yeah.
quote unquote, right? That he could just show off as he went from town to town, and that's not humanizing. That's exploitation.
Yeah.
Right?
Look who I
For your
fixed.
own, edification.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. See, the healing
Through
is
his wise. Yeah.
piecing life back together, right? So yeah. I think it's been productive, right? I think it's been fun. It's been a good conversation. Let us close in prayer with that. Yahweh, we're just thankful for a time to eat, share stories, and to gather and open up your holy stories and dive in and reflect and talk back and forth and give your stories agency in this room and in our lives. Help us leave this place looking for symptoms, but also looking for illnesses, where we can manifest your complete, restorative, redemptive healing in a world that needs it. Lord Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now I get to stop the recording.
Okay, go to the video for another 3 seconds.